I think the title of this lecture, Commitment and Defence, really requires a few words of explanation. What exactly do I mean by commitment? Well, the idea really has to do with the fact that any move, almost any move we play on the chessboard, involves us in some level of future obligation to justify it. As John Nunn points out in his book Secrets of Practical Chess, where he discusses commitment at some length, even a simple pawn move involves a small element of commitment, in that the square which the pawn used to defend, it can never again defend, and that creates the potential for a tiny weakness. More serious commitments would involve, for example, a sacrifice. If I sacrifice a piece, then I'm really committing myself to an attack in a big way. That's an obligation in the sense of, if I fail to drum up an attack, I'm very likely simply to lose the game. Of more interest, probably, are commitments which lie somewhere in between these two. Although the concept's not written about that much in chess literature, it's probably not entirely new to most people. For example, we're all fairly used to the idea that certain structures arising out of the opening lead to certain kind of plans naturally. This, in a sense, is another form of commitment. If I have a large space advantage on the queen side, but have created I'm more passive on the king side, for example, that pretty much obliges me to play on the queen side, again a form of commitment. Or if I take a lead in development in return for, say, some structural weakness, I have to do something with that lead in development. I'm pretty much obliged to either create some damage in the opposing position, turn this temporary advantage into some kind of a long-term advantage. Otherwise my own structural weaknesses will just start to tell against me. So then the second question arises, what exactly has commitment got to do with defence? Why have I put these two together? Well, if commitment is it's in the sense that it's an obligation, it can be an obligation for the attacker. If I have an advantage on the king side, for example, I may well have to put very many of my forces onto the king side in order to prosecute that advantage. This is a very common thing, and indeed this is what will occur in the two examples I'd like to look at today. Commitment to attack usually implies also a commitment of force, a concentration of force in one part of the board. This creates obvious possibilities for the defender, possibilities, for example, counterplay on the other side of the board, or perhaps, as we shall see in the case of the games I'm about to look at, some kind of re-evaluation of material priorities. Some pieces may become more important than others. Some pieces will become more important based on their function rather than on just their normal value. Let's have a look at this game by a famous Hungarian attacker, really a master of attack at times, but even he found that heavily committed to the attack in this game, promising though the attack looked, it ultimately wasn't enough for victory. So, we join the game at the point where white plays the move queen to h5, and, well, at first glance this looks like an extremely dangerous attack. White has chances to swing his rook into action on the h-file, targeting the h7 pawn, and black somehow has to bring around some element of force to defend it. Okay, black played the move probably close to the only reasonable move, playing knight e5 with the intention of reorganising his forces with rook to e8 and then knight to g6 to f8. This move also has the important feature that f3 is now covered, so the rook's most convenient swing square is no longer available. Sachs adapted to this situation by putting his rook to f4 instead, again intending to swing to the h-file. And black, as you can see, if he plays simply rook e8 first, then rook h4 is too quick. So it's necessary for black to make another tempo with his defence by playing the move knight to g6, again denying the h4 square and attacking the rook, forcing the rook to find another route onto the h-file, which is what Sachs does. He simply drops the rook back a square, so it's cost him a tempo, but he's got to the f3 square in the end. Black played rook e8. Again, this is his, well, probably his one and only serious defensive idea, to emerge from the position without serious damage done. Now at this point, it's worth noting a little tactical problem. Black has achieved quite a lot on the queen side. Typical, as I said, in the case where somebody is very heavily committed to the attack, it often involves an element of neglecting other parts of the board. That to some degree is what has happened here. Sachs has concentrated force on the king side to a degree that the queen side has been left a little relatively unprotected. However, Black's rook on b2, which is a great symbol of his successful counterplay, at the same time is on a slightly awkward diagonal. If we consider the fact that the rook lies on the same diagonal as g7, you'll notice very quickly, no doubt, that Black has a small problem in his intended defence. White plays immediately f takes g7, and the point being that now he's taken the f8 square away from the black knight, and the threat of rook h3 is extremely powerful indeed. Now what Black does next is no less instructive for the fact that it's forced. He really has no alternative but to take this pawn off on g7. Of course, there's an important tactical point here, which is that he's not losing a whole rook to this tactic, because he himself has a counter tactic with queen b6 check. Okay, it's sometimes in these examples it's easy to think, well, maybe this example only works because of that little tactical nicety. Well, okay, that's a point of view, but I think that in a position where White has committed force to the king side so quickly, tempi have been very important, and Black has been able to achieve counterplay on the queen side. It's not that surprising that White hadn't found time for the perfectionist move king h1. So the king finds itself on g1, and I don't find that terribly surprising. What is instructive from our point of view, though, is that by this, albeit forced, exchange sacrifice, Black very drastically changes the situation on the board. Suddenly, White's bishop on e3, White's black squared bishop, which was nicely placed on e3, is about to depart, and with it Black gains a good deal of control over the dark squares. Also, the knight on g6 is going to be able to retreat to f8, and pretty much White's attack on the king's side could come to a standstill if he doesn't take very decisive action soon. What he does is one of the reasons I like this example so much. White, even though he's now faced with what is often quite a difficult psychological situation, when at the expense of a small material investment, the defence has suddenly gained a good deal of control over the position. The attack has been blunted. This is a moment when a lot of people tend to make mistakes, and psychologically it's a vulnerable moment for the attacker. But Sachs here spots, not only spots that this is the case, but also understands very quickly that the assessment of the position is by no means as optimistic as he probably thought it was earlier. Consequently, he very objectively realises that the position is now no longer better than equal, and takes the opportunity to make, in a sense, a rather logical safety net bailout to his attack, and to force a draw with a further sacrifice. The point of commitment is this kind of position where White's forces are committed to the queen side, extremely poorly coordinated white pieces. Bad for trying to control the centre, and now that Black has sacrificed and gained control of the key squares on the king side, there's a real danger that the centre and the weakened dark squares could become the battleground. If they do, Black will stand well even with an exchange down, so White very sensibly realises now is the moment to strike, and he finds an excellent sacrifice which, in a couple more moves, results in a draw. If Black's king tries to come forward to e6, then white has the very powerful response bishop h3 check. So that's not playable at all. So black simply had to retreat to f8, white gave check on h6, and the game ended in a perpetual check. This is a very nice case of equilibrium between attack and defence, because I think both players played the position in the correct way. White was committed to attack, had to be committed to attack, and even when black defended in a way that challenged that commitment, he still found a way to make the attack work sufficiently for a draw. This was the main example I wanted to show in today's lesson. The next example is really rather similar to this in many ways, and I give it partly because it is a nice illustration, a similar illustration, and hopefully will reinforce the point, so it stays in the mind. Again, in the diagram position, white's position involves an undeniable element of commitment. This is, as I said, one form of commitment is simply material investment. In this case, white has sacrificed a pawn and is therefore pretty much committed to finding some attacking chances against the black king. Not only has he sacrificed a pawn, there are also a few weaknesses in his position, and these of course cause some of black's long-term prospects to be very healthy indeed. The knight on c5 is a beauty, and potentially black has some control of the dark squares if he can either exchange dark squared bishops or as we shall see later in the game, maybe even do better than that. Okay, but at the moment white has really quite a serious attack, starting with the move bishop h6. Now if black's rook simply moves to e8, white will swing his other rook over to f1, and the serious play on the on the f file, white can consider either the move g4 in response to any f5 by black, or possibly sacrifices on f5 also come into strong consideration. Black has a very useful, in effect it's a Zwischenzug, something I hope to talk about in some later lesson. He played the move bishop f6, not defending his own rook, but counter-attacking the white rook on a1. One of the features of commitment is probably that any exchange is likely to be bad for the attacker, or on average anyway. Not any exchange, but any exchange which doesn't remove a very key defensive black piece, and therefore white was sensible to keep all the rooks on the board and move his rook to f1, and the black bishop retreated to g7. At this point, white starts another interesting attacking idea. He plays pawn to g4. Now this has a rather nasty threat, and not a terribly disguised threat, but still a very nasty one, of playing g-pawn to g5, an exchange of bishops, queen h6 check, and rook h3, with extremely unpleasant consequences for the defender. Okay, but black nonetheless, there is an open e-file. Black's rook obviously can't go to it because it's tied to the defence of f7, but the queen came to e7, which is in the good tradition of active defence. And again, chances for counterplay elsewhere as a result of white's very heavy commitment to the kingside attack. Again, it's commitment, and in the strong sense that if white doesn't remain focused on the kingside, if he loses the initiative there, then the position is pretty much a disaster. So he played very sensibly his rook to e3, appears to take a touch of pressure off the f-file, but in fact leaves black with some tricky decision regarding his queen. Black needs this active counterplay on the e-file. He needs to have that measure of counterplay, otherwise this idea of the attack with g5, which I mentioned earlier, is really very dangerous. It's here that black makes his beautiful decision. It's not such a difficult decision, but it's a very nice one, and it nicely complements the idea from the Saxo-Dev game. Take a moment to see if you can guess what's coming next, but, well, as I said before, control of the dark squares might be enhanced by an exchange of dark squared bishops, they might be still further enhanced by something better, and in this occasion something better is an exchange sacrifice. Black played the very nice move, bishop to e5. What this does is pretty much in one go wipe out the majority of White's kingside chances if he takes the rook on f8. If he doesn't take the rook on f8, White's somewhat lacking for a plan now, because his main plan on the kingside involved exchanging that bishop on g7. In fact, White did feel obliged to take the rook. Black recaptured. White still played queen h6, still hoping, but now it's really just a hope for some play on the kingside. Black parried that with f6, and if you take a look at the position now and compare it with the position we started with, Black has two glorious minor pieces, the bishop on e5 and the knight on c5, and White's bishop on c2 has, in my mind, been transformed from, well, rather a powerful looking attacking piece when in conjunction with the other bishop. On its own, it's just a bad bishop. It's a bad bishop. Okay, it defends the pawn on a4, but that's pretty much the extent of its achievements. I don't want to take this game right through to the conclusion. I think this is the main point. This position is extremely comfortable for Black. Again, as I've said before, when considering an exchange sacrifice, always look at the possibilities for the extra rooks, and here there's a distinct lack of open files. The minor pieces radiate beauty and the rooks look not especially promising. The open b file is perfectly covered by the knight on c5. It's very difficult for White to have any active aspirations anywhere. White's position turned out to be good enough to hold the draw, but no more than that, and certainly in terms of the defence and the possibilities that a very heavy commitment to attack give, I hope both these examples prove to be instructive and helpful. Okay, thanks.